The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, I'm Fiona and I work in the marketing team for Contentful in Berlin. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar on integrating migrations in a continuous delivery pipeline. We're planning on holding more webinars in the future, so keep your eyes peeled on Twitter and on your email. Just before we start, I've got a few housekeeping things to go over. The webinar will be recorded, so the slides and the recording will be sent to you tomorrow. If you'd like to ask a question, just put it in the question box, and we've got time allotted at the end to go over your questions, so we'll field them then. And if you want to tweet us during the webinar, then you can do so. It's just at Contentful. So I'll pass you over to Shy now, and he'll kick off the webinar.
All right, thank you so much. So let's do this. So hi everyone, I'm Shy. I'm a developer evangelist here at Contentful. I'm really excited to be talking to you all today about continuous integration, our environments features, and our migration features. This talk, I'm going to throw it up on my GitHub after the demo, so you can check it out at your own pace afterwards. And there's some examples to the code that I'll be linking to later in the demo as well. If you want to just dig into the code, just hang in and we'll give it to you in just a little bit. So to kick things off, I want to talk about building software. And one of the first things that I learned at my first software engineering job is that there's kind of this law of building software, and that's that you never get it right the first time. I've been writing software for far too long, and I don't think I've ever successfully, spent an hour writing something, hit the compile button or rendered it and not get some sort of error. And with that attitude, I think it's really important to keep in mind that, when you can't guarantee perfection, really set yourself up to make it so that whatever you're building is malleable, making it so that it can change. And what could go wrong with, changing software? It's not like that's going to cause any more errors or any more problems at all. So I want to dig into how you can make some changes to Contentful and your content model. And to do that, I really want to talk to you about the Contentful migration command line interface. And so this is a really cool tool that lets you create content types, delete content types, edit content types, create and delete fields in those content types, and change the IDs of those fields. And it lets you do all of that programmatically through JavaScript. So this is a very basic migration that allows you to delete a field. So you're connecting to your content type, which in this case is a post, you're deleting it. And because it's JavaScript, that's something that you can check into your version control. You can have someone else take a look at it and evaluate it. And then you can call that migration script directly from the Contentful command line interface. So the command there would be Contentful space migration, and then the appropriate space and the access token, and then the JavaScript file itself. So using this tool allows you to make programmatic content model changes, which I think is really awesome because it gives you a bunch of really cool advantages. It's repeatable. You can do that content migration, as many times as you want. You can throw it into your version control, code review it, send it to your teammates. You can do sanity checks, review it, and you can use that command line interface to apply it. So I'm going to pull up just a quick video of me running a migration from yesterday. So this migration, I'm creating a field called movies. It's a symbol, so it's a short text field. I'm calling it from the command line. I'm saying what space we're using, and then I'm providing it a management token, which I've already expired, so don't try and use it yourself. The tool is going to pull up an interface kind of explaining this is what it's doing. Am I sure that this is what I want to do, to let me double check myself, and then it's going to run the migration and update the space up on the Contentful end. And this is really great, but you might be thinking, cool, so I've run this change against my master space, but what if I want to get rid of it? Or what if I want to test it or even check it out before kind of committing it to master? So that's where our latest feature, space environments, comes in. So space environments is something brand new that we've recently pushed out that allows you to create multiple versions of your master space and then make changes to them in isolation. Anytime you click that add environment button or you add an environment from the command line, it'll take your master, your default environment, and spin out a direct copy. So you can write migrations against your copy, make sure everything's working as it should. If something goes wrong, you can just delete the environment and spin a new one. And then when you're ready, you can run that test against your master. And in terms of local development, connecting to your environment is just one additional line. So a standard Contentful connection looks something like this. And all it takes to connect to an environment instead of your master space is adding the single environment line. And then even with our migration tooling, it's something similar as well. Running your migration against an environment, all you need to do is add in what the environment ID is, and Contentful will take care of the rest, making sure that it runs against the appropriate environment. If you don't include those environment IDs, we assume that you just want it to happen against the master space. And you can also manually list, environment ID equals master as well. So space environments are pretty cool. They let you do some awesome stuff. I think they're really useful for local development, spinning up an environment that you can, write your tests and your changes and do whatever locally, and then trash it when you're done, or respin it as you try things and you experiment things. They're great for setting up a staging and QA pipeline, having a copy of the master that you can recopy between, every kind of deployment to let you test things and make sure that everything is kind of up to date and in sync. And then for continuous integration. And continuous integration is really what we're here to talk about today. So I want to dig into continuous integration. So to just make sure that we're on kind of the same page, a simple continuous integration pipeline, kind of a really basic one, would look like building your code. So, you push your code up to wherever it compiles, then it runs your tests, and assuming those tests pass, then it deploys that code into production and updates all your deployment spaces. So adding Contentful and the migrations into that pipeline is going to need a couple changes. So when you build the code, as part of that, you're also going to spin up a new environment. And that new environment can be named really anything. In my example, what I've been doing is I've been naming them CI underscore and then my branch name. So they're unique kind of every time. And then you run those migrations that are in the repository against that new environment. You run your tests, and assuming all the tests pass, you move into that deployment phase. And as part of that deployment phase, you run those migrations that you ran in the build phase against the environment, against your master environment. So for this demo, I'm going to talk about Circle CI. We've built kind of a practical, functional proof of concept example that uses Circle CI. The code for that is up on the Contentful Labs GitHub organization, and I'll be linking to that at the end of the demo. But we do have a functional version of this kind of existing that you can dig into and use as an example, as you set up your organizations and your utilizations of Contentful. So with Circle CI, what I've done is I've added a few steps. So there's a step that using their kind of default config file, what I've done is I've added a step that prepares the environments. It's near the bottom there. And then as part of the deployment, I also have a step that updates the master environment. So in terms of keeping the code and the content model in sync, there's a few things that you have to do. One of them is including your migrations in your repository with your code, but also so the code knows kind of what migrations it needs to run. I've had to add one additional content type, and that's a version. So with the version, in the example that we're going to walk through, I'm using just kind of standard integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You could do it, whatever way makes sense for your product. You just have to set up the logic for it to be able to know and figure out, kind of what it should be running. And then in my my repo, I have a folder of migrations, and just to keep it simple, they're just integers. So when the migration runs, what it does is it checks to say, okay, I'm on version 4. We have migrations all the way up to 7. Let's run 5, 6, and 7 and bump up the version number to 7. And that way you can leave those migrations in your repo, and the CI pipeline logic will take care of updating everything. So with that standard config that Circle CI provides, that prepare environments for testing is really where all the magic in this example takes place. So I've created a migration or migrate.javascript file, and that's where all of my migration magic takes place. And I'm passing it the space ID, I'm passing it the branch name, and then I'm passing it the management key, so it can connect to the Contentful management API and make all of the changes and spin up our new environments and all of that. And then I also need to make sure that my tests have the ability to use the latest environment. So I'm a Python developer. I write a lot of Flask code, and so I'm using PyTest. And the only real change I have to make to the standard, PyTest call is provided the environment that it needs to run, whether that's master as part of the deployment step or the branch as part of the build phase. So let's jump into that migrate.javascript file. Because that's really where all of the magic of this example takes place. Now, we do have to use the Contentful CMA, the management tooling, because there's a few things that are going to happen as part of this process. So what we're going to do is we're going to connect to it. We're then going to take a look at the environments and see if the environment exists. If you push or if you run it locally, or you push a migration that fails for whatever reason, you might have an example or an existing version of that environment that is old or out of date, or is perhaps in like a detached state with a migration run against it that you don't need anymore. So the first thing that we have to do is double check and see if it's there. If it's there, we're just going to kill it. If it's not, we're just going to move on. And then we're going to spin up the new environment. So this is just a create environment with ID, which you give it the name, which in this case is going to be the branch name, so C underscore and the branch name. We're going to need to then update our API keys. In this example, I'm just updating all of my API keys to allow access to that environment. But you could also say specifically, this is the API key that Circle has access to. Let's update just this API key. If it's a brand new environment, our default is that the API keys aren't updated. So that is something that you'll need to do. And this is the major reason that we're using the CMA here, is to make sure that our API keys have access. If they don't, there's going to be an error that comes up because it's not found. Then we're going to go ahead and run the migrations that we need. So prior to this, I've taken a look at that repo. I've figured out what migrations need to be run, and then I just go ahead and run them. So that's pretty cool, or I'm excited by it. So I think it's cool. So in terms of how this works in practice, so here I've created the same migration as before. I'm adding that movies field. So I'm going to create a new branch, and I'm going to call it new feature. I'm going to go ahead and commit the code. And so all the major changes that I've made here is that I've added a migration, and I've also updated my tests. In this example, I'm going from having 6 content fields down to, I'm moving from 5 content types up to 6. And then I'm also adding, a test to make sure that this new movie type is there. So if it fails, the deployment will stop, and we won't see these changes make their way up to master. They should end just at the environment, and we can correct them and figure out what's wrong and make changes. So I'm going to go ahead and push this new branch up to GitHub, and then we can check it's all fine. I'm going to go ahead and make a new pull request with that new change. And as part of that pull request, Circle CI is going to go ahead and start running some checks for me. So let's go ahead and jump into Circle. I've gone ahead and trimmed this video a little bit just because Circle does take a little bit of time to run. So it's going to prepare the environment for testing, which it updates the new environment. It's going to run the migration. And it looks like that migration was successful. So it's going to run the tests, and the tests pass. And then we can go ahead and squash it and merge it because it's passed. And now it'll go ahead and run all of that on master, and it'll go ahead and also update our master environment for us, which is pretty cool. Now, as part of that, you could go in and you could also go and check out the, you could, do your standard version control stuff, have someone review the migration before it gets run. Something I really like to do with this is also just run Circle locally and just make sure that the entire process works before we get, before it even gets up to GitHub itself as well. And so this is kind of a simple way for you to integrate, your changing your content model into your delivery pipeline. Adding a step specifically to interface with Contentful, spin up that new environment, run any necessary migrations against that environment, and then also push that migration if your tests pass all the way into your production and have it run kind of programmatically rather than you manually going into the web app and making changes by hand and then hoping that you make those same changes successfully on deployment as well. If this sounds like something interesting to you, we also have the code up on GitHub as well, so there's a practical example that you can dig into and check out. It's one thing for me to talk about it. I think it's another thing to dig into the code yourself and kind of see how it's done. And also, we do have a tutorial up there as well that you can dig into and start, kind of figuring out how setting this up makes sense for your projects and integrating this kind of workflow into your projects would work. So I kind of went a little fast there. So Fiona, I was wondering, do we have any questions that we can jump into?
Hi,
Fiona,
yeah, we've got loads of questions.
Awesome.
Let's just have a look. Can you talk about the typical workflow for content editors? Are they editing in the master environment always?
Yes, so the content editors right now are just in the master environments. The environments feature is a feature that's intended for developers and just developers. So yeah, that would be kind of how that workflow is set up.
And does content migration script export content types and content entries, or can it be used to export only content types?
Yeah, so the migration scripting is for changing the content types. We do have another kind of tool for importing and exporting content types or in the entire space. Something interesting, I think, to kind of mention when it comes to kind of this methodology. Let's say Circle, for whatever reason, has some sort of outage while you're in the middle of a migration on your master environment. Potentially as a way to kind of, keep things safe, you might want to also add some sort of export to your space every time that that you're about to run this on your production, just as like a backup. So you could use the export tooling as its own thing, throw an export into S3, and if something crazy happens on the Circle end, or if you're running it locally and your machine crashes or whatever, and you end up in kind of that halfway state, then you'd be able to take that export and kind of push it in. But the export and import tooling is something that is kind of separate from this. That would be something you would need to add in additionally, and just again, depending on how much like fault tolerance you need, it would be something that you could do on your own. For this example, since it's just a basic example, I'm running a small little Marvel website up on Heroku. It's not a production thing. It's something that's just there. I've made as an example. It doesn't include that, but that is something that you would be able to add in if it was necessary, if it was needed for you.
And it would be amazing to have this content CLI, or more specifically the underlying API calls, implemented into a tool like Terraform? Any plans for that?
Not that I'm aware of, but we can follow up on that via email. So, but off the top of my head, I don't believe we have anything like that coming up. But we'll make sure to include a more concrete answer to that in the follow-up email if that's incorrect.
And does the deploy to master process take into account pulling over content from these sandbox environments?
It does not. The way that you could do that, though, is have adding that new content as part of your migration. So for the example, in the directory, there's a migration that I do to add an author field. Since it's a Marvel website, it adds an author field, and then there's a secondary migration that also, sets that author field to Stan Lee as well. And so that would be something that you could add into your migration script. But right now there isn't a way for you to merge kind of changes that you make on a sandbox environment or an environment back into master. Like there's no merge button, kind of how GitHub does it. It's writing a script and then pushing it up. And so if that is something that you would need to also add an additional migration that fills out and populates that content for you.
Okay, I'm looking for guidelines for selected content migration from one environment to another, content type plus content, for an organization that builds new features for our customers.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of documentation around migrations on the Contentful docs and on our website. In terms of running a migration from an environment to another environment, I think we'd need to dig in a little deeper. So feel free to just shoot me an email, and we can set something up to see kind of what the specific use case that you're talking about. I guess I think I would need a little more context to really go into detail.
And would you be able to use this to create test content for automated tests and then clean this up after, or is there a better way of doing that?
Yeah, so the way that I would think to do that is to have a separate, or have a testing phase that that makes a change to fill in kind of your dummy content onto an environment that then doesn't run on your master. So yes, you could do that. I'm thinking of kind of Python testing or Rails testing, where you run your tests, and as part of that, you create some sort of new database entry. You check your test to make sure that it validates, and then you wipe that content out. And so I think you could set a specific migration that fills in dummy content, and then run your tests to check that dummy content, and then run the real migration, assuming that all of it works properly on master, and just kind of skip that filling the dummy content phase as part of the deployment. So definitely, I think you could definitely do something like that.
And how do permissions work? We would not want all devs to push into the master environment, but want it in dev environments?
Yeah, so that would be, I think I would need to dig more into our roles and permissions to give you kind of a very clear context around that. So let me follow up on that one also via email. I'm not confident off the top of my head with roles and permissions in quite the granularity. I think I need to answer that question. So I'll follow up with that one via email as well, if that works.
Yep, loads of questions still coming in. Can you read?
This is great. Now I'm kind of glad I was fast at it, because we have more time to answer questions. So.
Could you re-explain the version control content type?
Yeah, so the version control content type is solely there to, so your content migration CLI knows what versions that it needs to run. So in this example, I have a version tracking of 8 or 0.0.8. And then in my migration library, I have 7 migrations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So in the example that I ran near the end, the content version was actually set to 6. So when it went in to look at the repo, it would check, okay, we're on version number 6. Let's see what migration files we have. Okay, we have we have a 7. 7 is one higher than 6. That means that the version that I'm running is out of date. So let's run 7, and then it updates the version number to 7. It's really just there to help help Circle know what migrations need to be run, and it could really be set up anyway. It's not something that'll be really critical, and so you could use standard 0.0.0 style versioning, or in this example, I'm just using basic integers, but it's really just there so Circle and that migrate.js file knows, okay, this is the migration, this is the version that we're at, this is how far behind we are, this is what migrations we need to run. And you can also set it up so it runs multiple migrations for whatever reason. So if we're on version 6 and we add 7.js and then 8.js, and 8.js just fills in the versions that 7.js did, like the fields that 7.js created, then it'll run both 7 and then 8 as well. So.
Okay, are you ready for the next?
Yep, hit me.
Is there an easy way for a rollback?
No, so rollbacks and downgrades are something that this specific example does not cover. In terms of rollbacks, similar to kind of how you would handle a database migration, you would also need to have a downgrade script. So there isn't an easy way to roll master back once you've committed that migration. If you've committed the migration to an environment, you could just delete the environment and spin out a new copy. But once that migration hits master, you would need to have some sort of downgrade script to push it back, or create a new migration that downgrades it back. But that's not something that this example goes into, and that's something that I'd be more than happy to chat. But the intent with this is kind of, it's a forward-facing kind of way of handling your changes to your content model.
And what would be the best practice to set up a new site? Would you make the initial content types using UI and changes would be done with the scripts, or make all using scripts?
So personally, when I run development, if I'm just doing it by myself, just me on my own, and no one else needs to see it, or I'm not working with someone, then yeah, I just do it all through the web app. I can be responsible to myself for the mistakes that I make. The moment that the site hits production and it's user facing, or the moment I bring in a second dev to work with, that's when I switch exclusively to script, and that way we can make pull requests, and we can review each other's work and have a general idea of where the content model is, and also make sure that when we do a deployment, that it's done in a way that isn't out of sync with the code. The code up there is matching the content model that is in Contentful, and the only way new code gets updated is if the content model also gets updated along with it. That said, if I'm just doing something with an environment, I've spun out a new environment, I'm trying to figure out what I need, I'll use the web app just to kind of test things. But then when it comes to moving that change into master, or having that change be reproducible, I go straight to the migration CLI and use that as well. So that's kind of my thought process on it. If it's just an individual web app, is totally fine. If it's an individual with production, pushing to production, or if you have more than one person working on the site, then yeah, you should go to the migration tooling and do it programmatically.
Do you recommend keeping the migration logic in a separate project, or would it make sense to keep it all within individual projects?
Yeah, so in this example, I'm keeping it in the same project, and that way, when I make the way that Circle CI kind of detects changes is on changes to the GitHub repository, and so rather than having Circle need to reach out to a second separate migration repo, it can just work with that same repo. And so I have it all in the same repository, so that Circle can just access all of it. It can do all of it from just one repo without needing to reach out. And that way I can also guarantee that if I'm making any migration changes, that they're being run. I might forget to push the migration to the specific new repository that I store my migrations in, and then we have an out of sync issue Whereas if I keep it in the same repository, I can make sure that that pull request only gets created when everything is ready and good to go.
Do you see a tool built for editor and content authors so they can move selected content from one environment to another? It seems like this is more dev friendly.
Yeah, so this is definitely a dev-friendly tool. Like I said, I'm not aware of anything coming down the pipeline for editors and environments, but we can follow up via email if that's incorrect. But yeah, this is definitely a tool for developers and enabling developers to make changes in kind of a safe way. There would need to be kind of different workflows that you can set up for editor kind of the editor way of doing it, and you can use our roles and permissions to kind of set up that editor workflow. If you're looking for a an approval before something gets pushed to the production site, the environments is not the right place to do it, but there are workflows that you can set up to make it so you have kind of that workflow with your editors, and that's all in the Contentful docs as well. But we can make sure to include that in our follow-up email as well, since there's a few questions about it. I don't think it hurts to have more info in the email, so we can definitely do that.
Would there be a good way to define all the content types programmatically?
Yeah, and so that's kind of what the migration tooling is for, is to define the changes to the types programmatically. You can, from the Contentful end, you can actually go in and you can click, in your content model and see the JSON version of it. And you can also do like an import and an export of that entire content model. And then, yeah, the migration tooling would let you change it programmatically as well. If you want to follow up, if you have more details of kind of what you're looking for with that question, I don't think I quite answered that fully. I think I need a little more context on what you're looking for there.
How does a migration that changes a model with content work? Would it throw an error because content exists with the previous implementation?
Yeah, so it does. The first thing it does is it checks to make sure that the migration is possible. And in the video that I showed, and let me go ahead and just pull that back up. In that video, it showed a kind of what it expected was going to happen. And so if it was a migration that was invalid for whatever reason, let's say you're adding a field that already exists or you're deleting a field that isn't there, it would throw an error and it wouldn't let you run that migration. So let me just go ahead and skip forward. So yeah, right here, it shows, this is the migration that's planning, and it checks to make sure that it's okay. And if it's not something that is valid or legitimate, it'll throw an error and it'll say, this is what the error is, whether it's the content type doesn't exist or the field already exists or the field you're deleting doesn't exist or whatever reason, it'll tell you explicitly and it'll throw an error. And then in terms of like the build process over on Circle would, catch that error and then stop running. And it would send you an alert that it failed, whether that's an email or like a notification in your browser as well. But yeah, the migration tooling does check, and then you can approve it and say yes, I want to run it, or you can just have it force and just skip that check phrase, which is probably what you'll need to do to run it on the CI pipeline. Is you'll need to just force it because you won't be able to manually say yes, this is what I expect as well. In which case, it would just throw an error.
Is there a different tool to compare environments, or one plans for one?
Sorry, could you repeat the question for me?
Is there a different tool to compare environments, or one plans for one? It might be place for one.
Yeah, so they're not off the top of my head. I don't believe we have any tools to compare them. The kind of workaround that I would make is you can go into your content model and you can view it as a JSON object. And so you could go ahead and theoretically just take that JSON object and the JSON object of another environment and do a comparison on the JSON. But I don't believe there is a like simple tool that you can run off the top of my head to just do a straight comparison. So that would be the way that I would do it if I needed to do it.
We are building a number of microservices, micro front ends. Are you aware of a pattern that would allow a given microservice /project to own a set of content types?
No. So the way that I would handle that is I would probably have multiple different spaces for each of those microservices. If that's not something that's possible, let's say you're reusing content, I don't have a good solution off the top of my head. I would reach out to, if you're an enterprise customer, I would reach out and see if you can talk to a CSM or a solutions architect, and they can dig into that as well. But off the top of my head, I'm not, nothing is coming to mind. Feel free to shoot me an email though, and we can jump on a call and dig into the example a little further and see what we can come up with as well. I'm happy to chat about that too. But off the top of my head, I'm not having anything come to mind.
Are the migration scripts transactions, as in what happens if the script fails midway? Would it be able to be rerun without error?
No, so that's a really great question, and I think that was alluding to I was really actually hoping to get this question as well. But no, if a migration does fail partway through, then you're going to have a content type or a content model that is in kind of a half state, and so depending on how fault tolerant you need to be, there's a bunch of different strategies that you can take to kind of mitigate the risk with that, whether it's exporting the content model before you run any migrations, and if it fails, importing that content model back to kind of revert it. But yeah, if there's, for whatever reason, you lose Wi-Fi or Circle has an outage, then yeah, you would be in a kind of halfway state of having a partial migration run, and so you wouldn't be able to rerun that migration because it would say, let's say you're adding four different fields, it adds the first two successfully, and then it fails for whatever reason, your computer reboots, then you would still have two of those fields in there, and so the migration, when you go to rerun it, would throw an error because it sees the two fields exist, and it expects them not to, and so you would need to dig in and kind of manually fix that, or import the backup that you made as well. So those would be kind of the two potential ways to deal with it. Again, I think the strategy for how you do that depends on like how risk averse your organization needs to be as well. So, and I guess the complexity of the migrations as well. If you're generally just making very simple migrations, then I think it's fine to do it one-off, and I think it's always better to break your migrations into kind of as small chunks as you can and just run more of them. That way, if you have a failure, you can take a look, be like, okay, it failed between, we were running migrations 4 to 8, it failed, taking a look at our content model, we are at 7, so the failure is somewhere between 7 and 8. And then you can dig in and figure out what the failure is and correct it, and then rerun 7 and then rerun 8, which is a little harder if all those migrations are one larger migration as well. That makes it a little more impractical to fix that problem. So in which case you would probably want to just revert to a previous content, or to the export of the content model that you made, and then just rerun the entire thing from scratch.
Will there be content ID collision during migration?
If there is content ID collision, the migration won't run. It'll tell you there's a collision and it'll throw an error.
Do you have examples of using this with other CI tools?
There is a Travis example that I'm working on that I'll be adding to that repo down the line. Today, as of this demo, we don't have an example outside of Circle, but it is coming. It's something that I'm working on, so it should be up pretty soon. So, and I'm not sure if we can email everyone who attended the webinar, but we'll definitely tweet about it as well, and probably mention it in the Contentful developer newsletter that we've updated the example to include Travis as well. And if there's a specific CI tool that you need this to work for, just shoot us an email and let us know, or shoot me an email and let me know, just depending on how much time and studying I need to do to figure it out. We'll see if it's something that we can add to the example as well.
This may be off topic, but would you see that the UI extensions would follow the same logic concerning CI?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. So I think your UI extensions would be something that would be separate from this, because I don't believe that they would be part of your testing phase. So, you're adding a UI extension, but at the end of the day, behind the scenes from the Contentful end, the data being stored and the data being provided to your application is still one of the data types that we support. The UI extension is just changing the way that you interface with that data or how that data is viewed. So changing a UI extension, I don't think would be something that you would test as part of the deployment pipeline. I could be wrong though, and if I am, we'll make sure to include that in the follow-up email. But I don't think that would make sense for kind of this example or this demo.
When you perform a rollback for content type and content entries, then would the actual content be rolled back to a last published state?
Yeah, so that depends on how you are coordinating it. So if you're running a migration, the published state won't change. If it's if you're deleting a field as part of that rollback, then the thing would disappear. If you're adding a field, then the content is going to be empty. And so I think part of that is really going to depend on like how you're running that rollback. If you're doing a rollback as part of the import export method, then yeah, it would be the content that existed at the time of the export. If you're doing the rollback by running a downgrade script, then no, it's going to be something, it'll be something different. And so I think the way that it happens depends on kind of how you handle rollbacks. Rollbacks isn't something that is part of this example, and that would really be dependent on kind of the strategy that you use to do rollbacks.
Do you have plans to do a DIT kind of merge of environments? So migrations will only be run on a dev environment and then merge to a QA master, etc.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Doing that is actually pretty complicated. We are talking about it internally, and I will follow up if that's something that's on our public roadmap. But it is something that we're having a lot of conversation about internally as well. And so I'll follow up if that is on our public facing roadmap in the email.
And I think this is the last one. This might be somewhat unrelated, but do you have any pointers for customers interested in integrating Contentful with the Zendesk knowledge base?
Oh, off the top of my head, no. I will be brutally honest and say I have not messed around with Zendesk myself, so it's a little out of scope for me. But we can reach out internally and see if anyone else at Contentful is able to answer that question, and if we are, we'll make sure to include it in the follow-up email as well. So
sorry, a couple more have come in. Have you seen other organizations using a production staging environment or a layer before production?
Yes, I have seen a few different organizations that do it this way. I don't believe I'm allowed to reveal them, but there are, I think, quite a few organizations that are doing it that way as well. And if you're an enterprise customer, reach out to your CSM, and they'll be able to let you know specifically, and they might be able to dig into details about which customers are doing that. But that's not something I'm aware of off the top of my head, which customers are doing that, or if I'm allowed to share which customers are doing that. But there are definitely customers that are doing it that way.
And I would like my migrations to take content from a Swagger file to put into our documentation. Is this something that can be done currently, or are there plans to make this possible?
Yeah, so the migration files themselves are just JavaScript. So if you can write the JavaScript to take a Swagger file and convert it into data, and then take that data and inject it into Contentful, that is totally something that you could do. I don't believe we are writing any Swagger to Contentful tooling, but that's definitely something, since it is JavaScript, that you can write yourself.
And using the feature flipping model, how do you group several content types and content entries under a same feature to allow partial rollback?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the feature flipping model myself, and so I don't want to answer a question about something that I'm not familiar with. I don't want to give you incorrect data as well.
Okay, I think that's everything. Every question
Cool.
I think we've covered, apart from someone else wanting to know if it's a cardboard cutout of yourself behind you.
Yes, there is. When I was 19, I was working for Boeing at one point as part of a university project, and I convinced them that it was really important that we get a cardboard cutout of a captain and like a pilot. And for some reason, they agreed and gave me the budget to get a cardboard cutout made. They didn't say who the cardboard cutout needed to be of, so I decided to get it made of myself. It's great at parties, but yeah, that is a cardboard cutout of me sitting behind me. I haven't thrown it away since I got it made because it's too weird to throw away. So.
Okay, well, I think we've covered everyone's. Oh, someone someone else wants to know what the story is behind your morning, good morning, good night Twitter.
Okay. All right. I think we're getting a little out of scope. So if you're just sticking in for technical questions, I think it's okay to sign off. But feel free to tweet that question at me, and we can answer those questions on Twitter. But let's keep them out of the webinar.
Yeah. So I think that's everything. It will be sent to everyone. Will receive the recording and the slides tomorrow, and yeah, we'll try and follow up with everyone if they had any other questions we missed, or if there was a couple, Shy, you mentioned that people wanted.
Yeah, there's definitely a few things we'll be following up via email as well.
Cool, great, thanks so much, Shy.
Cool, thank you everyone for coming. So, and feel free to shoot me any emails if you have any follow-up questions. More than happy to answer via email what we couldn't get to in the webinar. Cool.
Great. Have a good day.